So restart. First of all, welcome. Good to see everybody. But my first impression is that we have a smaller group, which I think is starting to consolidate for all kinds of reasons. I think over time people get excited and then a lot of people join. Paul, good to see you. But our first session, I think we had like 100 people over the world. They're all welcome, of course. But that really has to, I think, quickly lead to a decision about how each session can proceed based on the size and the background. Because I know some of you already, and I know you're quite immersed in the text. And I've always said I'm not presuming to treat this like a course where I'm teaching. And I had a good conversation with Michael. Michael, you're more than welcome to come in as well and restate your suggestions. But we can kind of think about a rotation. I can do the first couple of introductions to different sections of the text and do what we did last time, have a general discussion. I'll do a little facilitation, but by no means no back and forth Q&A. I'm tempted to do that because I'm always in my teaching mode, but that's not the purpose of this group. We're all collaborating here. We're all coming from different backgrounds, and I really respect the backgrounds you're bringing, and I want to learn. So I'd like to take a step back. So, Michael, did you have some ideas you wanted to share, or was that a good summary of what we talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just affirm that. I'm sure some of you, maybe all of you, have done this yourselves, where in a seminar format, you take turns either in resuming what was covered the last time, or making a brief presentation, suggesting some lines of text to take a closer look at, maybe another article, another point of view. The one thing is, the point of doing that is not majesty. You just like get some ideas and content across that we can all work with, rather than have it be a contest to see who does the
Right.
best possible job in presenting the material.
Exactly.
So it's really that simple. And the point of view, and Raj, I was like, wow, you shouldn't feel guilty about dominating conversation for a bit, and making sure we all understand where you're coming from. The other points of view will come out. One other just biographical point of view: I'm not working on any book or context here, so I would prefer. I mean, I'm happy to kick things off as you suggested, Raj, at some point in the future here. But since I don't have some work that I'm trying to conduct here, I'd rather have others play a
Sure.
bigger role.
Great. Thank you, Michael. That was that
Yeah.
clarified a lot.
Yeah.
Some of you may be already working on certain aspects of Heidegger, maybe not being in time per se. I know some of you are doing work on later Heidegger. And quite frankly, some of you are working in different areas of Derrida at this particular moment. Maybe you're reading a certain text, but if you feel particularly inclined to comment on a section, just let me know, and we can go that way. Paul, not to pull you in and surprise you, but if you want to share some perspectives, I know you have a history of leading groups and have been very successful. And you had some ideas for me as well, but you're more than welcome to share.
Yeah, hi everybody. I run another Derrida group, which has been going for nearly 2 years now. And the end of last year, we started reading the introduction to the origin of geometry, and we're going to go back to it later this year. I mean, but I feel we've just scratched the surface of this text, which is, I feel, very important.
Yeah.
And I'm interested here in seeing what connections you make with being in time, which I read a long time ago.
Okay.
I'm a translator, and I have a background in linguistics and sociology, so I'm primarily interested in questions related to language, and in particular, I'm interested in the way Heidegger is translated, and the way Derrida is translated, for that matter. I think Heidegger is more problematical in many ways in respect to the translation.
Yeah. The French and Heidegger reception in France is a long, complicated history, and it's the various types of critical appropriations and attempted critiques of Heidegger by Levians, by eventually Derrida, recur as his own, who's alluded to many times in his opening moment. The different Merleau-Ponty's reception. Sorry, there's so many different generations that are absorbing Heidegger, as they are absorbing Husserl, and Hegel, and of course Nietzsche and Freud and Marx and Kant, um, is itself not unproblematic, and we can question the French reception. That's why we want to actually look at the text of Being and Time in parallel or simultaneously. So what we can do is to kick things off. Again, I don't want to. I want to just take maybe. Can I ask for the next question before we start? How long do you think people can go for today? I'm actually pretty good past 9:30 my time on the East Coast. It's 8:38 now. So if people want to stay, they can do that. If people have to leave, that's fine too. We'll have the recording. Yeah, great. Because I got some suggestions. I don't know how people feel. When you go in a deep kind of discussion about text, especially on these types of texts in philosophy, we do a disservice by trying to cram everything into one hour. I have to leave early for sure, John. So we'll try to go. I think I gave you a little bit of the background that I recall. Even the public lectures by Derrida in the United States when I was a grad student was set for 3 hours in the auditorium, but it felt like 4 or 5. You know, the French context is different, as you know. They lecture and it's not even a Q&A. And then a separate course for credit for PhD students, predominantly comparative literature and very few philosophy for the analytic dominance that didn't accept it. If anyone is not muted, maybe they might want to do that. If they have some background noise, and then that might be helpful. Yeah. So the PhD seminar was supposed to be allotted for 1 3-hour block per week, and that could go on for 4 or 5 hours. So just to give you a sense of lecturing and or teaching a seminar, it's just we felt someone said scratching the surface. That Paul said that. And that's the method. So what I want to try to do here before introducing some aspects of both texts, and then we'll have our discussion, is to, for me, one of the Derridean or deconstructive senses about time reading in text is that, or just to speak very bluntly and clearly, I myself can't suspend or reduce or defer all the other later Derrida texts that I'm aware of and I kind of live in when I go back to such an early, very early text. So I see, in other words, like future traces, like what is to come, but also what's buried here in this very early translation in Long Age. His first published work, 1962, is the French. I thought it was 61. Foucault's History of Madness, his dissertation is 61. I think Totality and Infinity was also around 60, 61, 62. Nothing else. Very formative early period there in the early 60s. But in any case, I see a lot of the later Derrida already here. But of course, it hasn't been, the phrases haven't come out yet. Difference, for example, at least not right now. You do see trace and residue. There's no speech writing and full-fledged critique you get in grammatology. There's no apparent engagement with Heidegger. He's not even named Aristotle, Hegel, and a bunch of Hegel. And then we're going to have to go back to the Heidegger text. So there's a lot of foreshadowing going on here for themes and deconstruction that a lot of us care about. So I want to try to isolate what some of those might be instead of trying, and then maybe for the discussion, we can actually read the text and interpret them. I'm going to bring them up. We can look at them. I do have a couple of passages I want to share. So this should be Origin of Geometry, if you can see that. Chapter 1. So just to scroll back and show you the whole thing. This was Origin of Geometry, introduction and translation. This is the English translation of the Derrida's French. 1989 is the edition from John P. Levy, who's a translator, who I mentioned has a nice introduction, a preface where he introduces kind of like how this relates to the entire Derrida corpus, which is great. But we're going right into the text, and we're doing chapter 1 here, which is page 27. We did the introduction briefly. The whole thing is about 90 pages or so. Typical Derrida, an essay becomes a book. Or an essay with subsections, like Husserl Dame is supposed to be one article, but you can see it's 6 subsections in Husserl Dame, which is like a little book, if you ask me. So let's go to the text. And then we'll go very quickly. I know it's hard to do that, but just there's one problem I want to isolate in leaving time about is a problem with the circle, the question of being, the question of the meaning of being, the inquiry into the question, the relationship between that and the inquirer, the status of being. What he calls the problem of the circle that he's breaking from. He doesn't want to be accused of some kind of circularity, especially with regard to a subject and an object. The subject is a human being, the object is being, for example. So let's go to the 27. Oops, where am I going so far? Apologies. Okay, chapter 1. So as we discussed before, he's giving us a lot of the earlier works of Husserl, like philosophy of arithmetic. The origin of geometry comes at the very end. One of his arguments is that the same kind of burning questions about origins, the origins of sense and sensibility, what consciousness intends. He doesn't like the psychologistic, positivistic models of understanding the human mind or human imagination. But we're also not doing what most social scientists, and quite frankly, most Anglo-American social scientists do, which is this kind of empirical history. What's important to note here is this problem of this what's called the phenomenological reduction of history itself. And what we find here is if history is taught or thought about, let's say the history of science or the history of philosophy in a neutral way, that you can just stand here in the present and look back and kind of summarize or explain what people did and how things were caused and what were the effects and write this nice narrative, okay, that's fine, empirical history. But it's also not what he calls psychological genesis, at least for the sense. And I don't want to take a detour through Kant here because he's not mentioned. But those of you that might be familiar, there's an interesting moment also in the Critique of Judgment where Kant's making a distinction between something like Newton coming along, discovering all the great laws of gravity. For those of us that think about science and the history of science, and when I was younger, I deified someone like Newton. Indisputable genius living in the 1600s doing what he did. He did it, not his neighbor, not his cousin, not his teacher at Cambridge, on the farm during the plague. So Newton did it. Well, what does that mean? And he said that even the ability for Newton to look at the predecessors like Galileo and others and Copernicus and just patch together, once it's done, it's repeatable and teachable and probably rediscoverable by somebody else. That's different from fine art. When nature gives the rule to art, we're talking about a givenness there. And it's sort of a similar problem that you find in Kant too, which is it's irreproducible one-time event. It has to be received as something, probably to the artist and also to, and maybe not the artist, but at least the reception of art. Later, Heidegger is going to get into this as well. But, there's a distinction between the origin of some kind of scientific theorem, proof, paradigm theory, and let's say the genesis of art. So unrepeatable in both the event, and it's the question of what it would take in terms of the conditions for it to even occur, but more so, how can it be received? And then how do we recognize it? To use Kantian language, intuit something, understand it. How can we subsume what that manifold is within some kind of concept that gives us some kind of sense of understanding, even though we'll never really have access to whatever it is in itself. So let's put that aside. But the point is, empirical history is not going to help us, and the psychology of genius is not going to help us. That's one. Historicity is not made a phenomenological problem for Husserl. This is the breakthrough for I would imagine, the 60s generation of the French. Foucault would do it in his own way with the history of madness in different institutions in the West. Here's Derrida going right after some of the hardest questions, and for him, the continental philosophical context. So historicity is not history. Possibility of history, it's not made a problem. But I want to take you to this really startling passage here. Two things that I could foreshadow deconstruction. So when I read this, we must be careful here. These ambitions, what's happening in the very late period there, the crisis, and then the origin of geometry, and after that, Husserl dies. So Whatever he was getting at the very end there, he couldn't continue. Are only served by already familiar themes which they orient in a new direction. That's what the later periods. Instead of seeing it as a prolongation of crisis, we might be strongly tempted to see the origin of geometry after taking into account the brevity of the sketch only as a preface to the reissue of the earlier formal and transcendental logic. Logical Investigations, 1900, the breakthrough for Heidegger and for many others, and then the later works, middle period works of Husserl, working things out, the ideas, formal transcendental, the critique of meditations, experience and judgment. But this crisis comes at the very end in the 30s. Reissue of formal transcendental logic, whose purpose simply would be to adapt it to a material ontology. In his introduction to that work, Husserl perceives the motif of radical investigations of sense within the present condition of European sciences. So it's not the traditional history of science, even philosophy of science, epistemology of science, but an investigation into sense, maybe Bedeutung, meaning, very important for Heidegger, question of meaning of being. We're going to get to that in a second. But we know that for Husserl, the critical significance of this situation results less from some epistemological conflict inherent in the internal development of these sciences than from a divorce between the theoretical and practical activity of science and the very renown of its progress and success. Scientists may be occasionally debating what's happening inside their paradigms, what Kuhn might say. They rarely take time to reflect on the nature of science. And what they do is the work of science as an activity, as a practice. It's collective, especially these days. There's no individual breakthrough like an Einstein working in relative isolation. Practical and theoretical activity. So, and it's not about an internal matter inside the sciences. We can't go to the sciences about the origin of something, especially mathematical idealities that are supposed to be eternal. Just what to do that. And then B, so the internal conflict within the science divorced from that practically, and B, its sense for life and the possibility of being related to our whole world. That's where we're going to go back to Heidegger. It's already there, though, here. This freeing of science with respect to its basis in the Lebenswelt, the life world, and its founding subjective acts undoubtedly remains a necessary condition for its conquest. And Husserl is not simple, by the way, in the Logical Investigations. It's not, when we say consciousness is always intending towards something, that thing is not a fact, an object, a predetermined entity, even being as presence, if you want to go with Heidegger. It's not that simple. It's not the Hegelian problem in response to the Kantian problem, marrying some kind of subject object in some kind of Aufheben to a higher notion of their connection, absolving all those contradictions in the history of metaphysics. There's something else going on here. This freeing of science with respect to its basis but this freeing also involves the threat of an objectivist alienation. What is he saying here? Which conceals the instituting origins and renders them strange and inaccessible to us. The great breakthroughs of antiquity in terms of the origins of geometrical theorems, they're strange again. They're phenomenologically, they could present themselves as strange and inaccessible to us. Internally to math, like, oh yeah, Brahmagupta's theorem, a Pythagorean theorem, I get it. Okay, yeah, you can show me. You teach a kid in the 6th grade. Once they get the basics and get them there and get excited, oh wow, that's it, cool. A squared plus b equals c. Oh yeah, that's how it works. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to do this phenomenological appreciation of how that even becomes possible, but not as a transcendental project outside of history. So there's a historicity problem, but not history either, because it's unfamiliar. This occultation, that's cool, which is also a technization, writing, scripting, supposes the naivete of a higher level of an investigator becomes irresponsible and simultaneously ruin the great belief of the sciences and philosophy in themselves. It has made our world unintelligible. So, we're not here out to glorify the history of science and great scientific breakthroughs. To make it a philosophical problem and a transcendental project with regard to what it means to exist in our world, not just how we have knowledge as beings, Kantian problem, but sense, like how do we even, the sense of the formation of the event of saying a theorem was born. How about that, as opposed to just diving into the theorem, the mathematical theorem? I'm going to come back to, so let me finish this piece here. To meditate on or investigate the sense, Besinnen, of origins, the deconstructed problem, not some ready-made origin that's present to us because it's retained as memory, or we're told something that we have to believe, either birth certificate sitting somewhere. So not that origin, but the sense. Make oneself responsible. He's getting this from Husserl. This is amazing. Make oneself responsible for the sense of science and philosophy brings this sense to clarity of its fulfillment, and put oneself in a position of responsibility for this sense starting from the total sense of our existence. Amazing. Responsibility for a sense of our existence. That part B, the highlight disappeared on B. The sense for life and the possibility of being related to our whole world. Okay, so we're not quite there to all the themes of deconstruction we're familiar with later on in Derrida. And the only mention we get here, we'll look at this and I'm going to pause and quickly move to being time. Hopefully, for 10 minutes we can start. Materially determined ontologies are subordinated to formal ontology, which treats the pure rules of objectivity in general. You know, Heidegger is going to question the entire history of ontology. We'll get to that. But here Derrida is saying, look, we're not talking about formal ontology here. Something else is going on with phenomenology before it becomes deconstruction, by way of historicity and, of course, this problem of speech and writing. But this material problem, not materialism, not Marxian dialectical materialism, not the materialist view of philosophy, which is not uncomplicated, but material determined ontologies. Why is he linking this to this ideality, which is going to be geometry? Now, geometry is a material ontology whose object is determined as the spatiality of the thing belonging to nature. Whoa. That later on or earlier, I believe he talks about thinghood and things, which is a problem for all of Husserl, Heidegger, and quite frankly, Derrida. But to call this ideality, which is not just an intuition, not a concept, not the thing in itself, not a pure description of a logical proposition or formula, but a material ontology whose spatiality. You're wondering about encryption and writing and technization. You know, when he overturns that whole speech hierarchy, speech writing distinction, speech, presence, living, thinking, subjectivity, writing is the dead copy, writing is inferior. That's the history of the West. It's too bad that dead authors aren't around. You can't, you, the reader, have to interpret things. You're not going to get back to the writer and ask them questions. It's inferior. Better to just be present and talk to each other. So we can understand each other. Now, what he's saying, this geometry and the origin of sense that's going to go into this material ontology is determined by a certain spatiality or spacing. It's not nature as in physical nature. Even Kant himself says that the roundness of the plate, we're eating off the plate, it looks like a circle, has some bearing or relationship to what we might intuit as the same feeling we could have for a geometric circle that is not supposed to describe any object. It's just an idea of a circle. They have a relationship. He talks about this in schematism. Okay, but the takeaways here, to just stop for a moment. Historicity is not empirical history, not the history of individuals and subjects. There's some occultation or hiding that's going on in the origin of sense. To make the origin of sense a problem requires these other tools that he's going to have to develop. Husserl did not develop this. He's very clear, this problem of historicity. So what the heck is historicity? You can't even, maybe it's like Heidegger. We're not going to say what is being. We have to reframe the question of the meaning of the question. So Derrida too is wondering, how's this linked to a certain responsibility? Can't turn to scientists and philosophers traditionally. They can tell you in the process of talking about what they do, they end up glorifying what they're doing. And that's not what this is about. This is about really kind of understanding our relationship to everything, our existence. is at stake in this? You say, what do you mean our existence is at stake in this? This is like some boring stuff about geometry. Husserl's formal and transcendental logic. So it ends here. We'll do chapter 2. Maybe I just read this last point because it is, this last paragraph, it is odd because I'm concerned about reversal, Umkehrung, sorry, and also this phrase spiraling movement. By a spiraling movement, which is a major find of our text, this is what he's claiming he's finding in the original. A bold clearing is brought about within the regional limits of the investigation and transgresses them towards a new formal radicality, that exerg and outgrammatology, the monstrosity, the future anterior, the closure but not end in metaphysics. Something's breaking down, a crisis that's breaking down in his world, the human sciences, to not be able to philosophy and what they call the human sciences. Maybe we call it the social sciences. Linguistics. The legacy is secure. New radicality is being announced, right? And a lot of us are trying to come to grips with that in Derrida. Not the history of metaphysics, but also not the escaping from it. But like Derrida had the traces that are there, they erase themselves. They show themselves in that erasure. They also remain. They can't completely disappear. This is his questioning of Heidegger's being and beings. The difference itself has to be leveled in order for Heidegger to start. But then how does he start? Does he presuppose some meaning of that difference? Does it hide in his thinking, even though he says it's been collapsed? If you recall the critiques he's making of Heidegger. New radical concerning the intentional history of an eidetic science, in this case, math, geometry, a sense investigation of its conditions of possibility will reveal to us exemplarily the conditions and sense of the historicity of science in general. Universal historicity, the last horizon for all sense and objectivity in general. Sorry. Okay. Consequently, the architectonic relations evoked a moment ago are complicated, if not inverted. This would demonstrate, if it were still necessary, at what point the juridical order of implications is not so linear, and how difficult it is to recognize the starting point. See, that to me is fascinating. Phenomenology is hard because it requires a suspension of you starting somewhere as yourself, or even your understanding or your consciousness. Whatever you built up in it, all the sediments, because all of us had to go to school at one point and learn some basic mathematics. Maybe some of us went to a higher level, to calculus and beyond. And I don't want to, I'm not going to go back and recover. And going back there and recovering how I learned all that stuff is not going to help me get to this question of sense, especially the sense of the origin of how those things came about. Need something more radical. Historicity is not about universalism versus relativity. He talked about an alienated objectivity, meaning you take away the human component in the human discussion about the creation of human creation, of human knowledge and human discovery of something like science, which could care less about whether it comes from a human or not. It is true. It's eternal. It's fixed. Let's discover more of it. It's fun. Mathematicians get that theorem. It's a new theorem. Oh, we haven't proved the theorem yet, but it's solid. Let's get the proof. Okay, let's work on that. Again, I don't want to come off as disparaging mathematicians. It's not going to help. That's not what we're doing here. There's something more radical here. I want to apply so historicity, movement, material ontology, encryption, not about literature yet, and not about the history of metaphysical text, later in psychoanalysis. Later Derrida, what follows with the Derrida will go into that space. Lacan, securing linguistics, signifier, signified, sign, differentiation, the slipperiness of the relationships. All the work on speech and writing. No, but not the dismantling of objectivity because we don't believe in it, or skeptics, or we believe in relativism. None of this applies here. This is the going for the grounds. So speaking of, let's quickly turn to, if it's okay, unless we want to pause or somebody wants to say, Raj, this is completely wrong, or I'm off. Or maybe we just save your deconstruct the text and my perspective. Paul, please.
Can I just ask one question about one word?
Sure.
The word juridical in that last
Yeah,
paragraph is
right.
juridique in French. I mean, I feel that can't be the kind of natural meaning of that word. Is it some special usage that Derrida is making of that word? And is it related to the contrast between de jure and de facto that he
Yeah,
raises
great
quite
point.
frequently?
Well, juridical, I don't want to put this back into the intellectual historical context, but they're all kind of obsessed at that point with deconstructing the history of at least the early Foucault, for example, in the terms of the sciences that then join with law and policy to objectify not only madness, but the approach and the encounter with it in terms of institutional knowledge. But that juridical, de facto and de jure subsumption, the horizon, that last horizon for all sense and objectivity in general, architectonic relations evoked a moment ago are complicated, if not inverted. That would suggest from our semester at what point the juridical ramifications are not so linear. I mean, could you take that to mean that once something happens, the back and forth in the history of science, it took some mistakes and then some eruptions. Two things happened at once. Leibniz and Newton co-invent the calculus, and yet, but once it appears, it's instantaneously under like it's legally sanctified, is unquestionable. It has authority that goes unquestioned. But the radicality of the investigation via historicity about the origin of the sciences, that it's going to lead to this really alienated objectivity because we don't know what the heck the whole thing is. That's the ontological problem. The isness of that is when we talk about even our perception or apperception of math, our encounter with it. Like maybe that I'm just guessing here. Right? It's a great question. I don't know unless you have a different view about.
Canonical might be a better translation.
Oh, better translation.
Canonical might be a better translation.
We'll have to get to the German. This is a good segue because Heidegger, gets into trouble very early on. In English, we say something as a fact. You can't see it, but my sweater is right there. So it's hanging on the wall opposite. Factual. It's a factual statement about that fact, and that's pretty simple. Facticitate, factical, facticity. The English translations of Heidegger's German, which is what Macquarie Robinson will take us to, about being in the world as a starting point that's not subjective or objective, the objective fact, the subjective assertion of the fact, the neurobiological fact of my subjectivity that the neurobiologist wants to describe. So we'll put that over there. We have this material ontology, alienated objectivity. Geometry, of course, is some kind of encryption in space. And is like space aliens or non-humans involved in the process somehow? And occultation when it arises, and then it appears, and then there's like almost either immediate sense of its reception or it takes some time, typically immediately. Unlike Hegel's phenomenology, as he says in the preface that, sorry, I know people are not going to understand this. It's in the nature of truth to appear in its own time, and the intellectuals of the time are going to dismiss you, walk you out the door before the end of the party. But most authors, after some time, have no audience, and some after some time do, meaning himself. It sounds arrogant or prophetical, but point is that that's the point here. I mean, especially for philosophy, but what the heck is it? Maybe is a big question, and not just what the heck is it, but what's our relationship to it that puts ourselves into question when we receive it, which I think might be the good way to go back now to go to Heidegger real quickly. And then, we started at 8:30. I apologize. I said 20 minutes, but it's almost impossible. I'm just trying to get out some structures here and then we go on. This is going to take a little too long to get through everything. I don't want to go section by section. It's 2 or 3 pages. but at least we can get to the initial definition of Dasein. So I do have to read that paragraph. And as I do, we can bring up what was said just a little earlier. The average understanding for Heidegger of being, referring to this paragraph, we have to use is, for example, in English, S in German. Paul, the French lech, what would be lech? Can I use the L? Etre. Anyone can introduce anything. To be, sein, and then Essen, but also for us, to be is. For French, Spanish, ser, for Spanish, for French, to be, lech. In any case, we have to presuppose it linguistically in order to just talk about anything, not just what exists. Forget about a metaphysical investigation into being in its categories. We're not done with that. Just being ourselves requires that we, for the most part, don't question our usage and assumption of the verb when we say anything at all. And we have to use the verb to be to pretty much do anything. Now, some languages may vary in this, which is interesting. For example, Chinese. But I'm just going to go with the that may be assumed, and there are going to be many entities that problem itself and that question itself could take the form of an entity. And there are many entities. One of his assumptions early on is that the being itself is not going to be a being, ontological difference. But he's concerned about the question. He doesn't want to pose traditional ontology, what is being, come up with some answers. We're inhabiting the question. Presumably there's a we. The we is inside that question. The question is inside the we. Maybe there's a special priority here of the questioner, Derrida as investigator of sense, which is not the geometrician, not the traditional history of philosophy, and not what scientists tell you today about how things work, or psychologists trying to analyze that. Something else is going on, the tradition, our textuality, the encryption, the possibility for sense. That's radically alienating because you don't have that humanistic intuition of what you're talking about in terms of the beauty of a theorem. It's like you're almost agnostic. But you're like, hey, I don't. What are you talking about? Why do you think this is such a beautiful? I don't even know what you're talking about. Like sense, make it sensible for me. As a, we have to be responsible for this. That's what we just finished. But here, similarly, Heidegger is like, okay, I'm not going to answer the question of being, but some entity is going to take priority here, not because it's something arbitrary. He also questions like, why do I make this a priority thing? And most of the translators don't even want to translate Dasein as being there, being here. But let's see what Heidegger says about the inquirer. If the question about being is to be explicitly formulated, transparent, seeing through it, cleared. There's earlier conversations about the translators about what's going on. Known to itself. The question has to be formulated. The whole work almost is spent just like being worried about formulating this correctly. So we have even a remote chance to answer it. And then he has to set up this prior thing called the Dasein analytic, which is what the whole book is about, to do this fundamental ontology, to be able to answer that question. Question about being is explicitly carried through in such a manner as to be completely transparent, then any treatment of it in line with the elucidations we have given requires us to explain how being is to be looked at, how its meaning is to be understood and conceptually grasped. It requires us to prepare the way for choosing the right entity for our example and to work out the genuine, authentic, and earlier the translators tell you, don't think of our English authenticate. I'm authenticating and stamping this passport. I'm not going to redact names from a file that the FBI is collecting. Some of you may know what I'm alluding to. Authenticating the truth, verifying, not that authenticity. Genuine, authentic is, I'm going to be sincere, I'm not hiding anything. I'm not hiding my cards. I'm not trying to be duplicative here. I'm not dissimulating. just sense of feeling too, in a way. Maybe it's not subjective, but trust. Work out the genuine way of access to looking at something, understanding, conceiving, choosing access to all the ways of behaving are constitutive for our inquiry, and therefore are modes of being for those particular entities which we, the inquirers, are ourselves. Thus, to work out the question of being adequately, we must make an entity, the inquirer, transparent, he's saying in his own being. So it sounds like he's pointing to the human being. Each of us are that. It's not me, the subject with my own I or name or biology or presence right now in this body. It's not that I, because there are all these other things constitutive of Dasein. The they with Daseins, other Daseins with things, equipment, things that are ready at hand, present at hand, not being in the world. But go back to the table of contents, even the title. Time is the horizon for understanding being. This book is not about understanding being, it's about formulating a question of the meaning of being. Or to formulate that question, if it's going to be that any understanding of it is going to involve time, but time is not linear. We're going to question the history of metaphysics or their interconnection. Aristotle, he finds this struggling with this in the physics. Time as the sequence of now points is not the limit, but also the change and the dividing. It's a connection, it's a separator, it's coming and being and passing. You get to that in division two, the question of linear time, which starts with Aristotle, and also Kant's schematism, before and after being in time. Time forming for our sense to be able to reproduce anything like a memory, let alone anticipate things to come as possibilities. That type of discussion for both Aristotle and Kant. But time is horizon understanding. We're going to focus here on an entity that has, for Heidegger, some kind of privilege in its own being, because the possibility of understanding being is built into it. But this is the questioner. This is the one that's raising it. And as you get along into being in time, which we're going to try to do, for those of you that know it, by the time you get to division two, and it's not stated here, death, caring first, death, responsibility and resoluteness to have a conscience, and then understanding the allotted time we're given in terms of reckoning it, that we're going to die. We see other people die. We're not dying that death. It's probably going to happen to us. We won't know when. Even if we know we're dying, let's say from a terminal disease, we're not going to know the exact point of the flat line. And we certainly are not going to come back to tell about it. It's an indefinite, irreplaceable, certain, singular, radically individuated experience of our uncanniness with regard to that happening. And yet we fall away from that because we typically don't want to think about it. We're too scared to think about it, or we're flippant and we're like, oh, okay, it's not going to happen right now. Again, people, they don't really think it's going to happen to them. That's division two. But think about that. Dasein's going to come back to time. Time is horizon for being. I say all that because we're going to have to get to this problem on the circuit, which I just wanted, and then I'll stop. The very asking of this question is an entity's mode of being. So posing the question, this is great for Heidegger. We're taking on fundamental ontology, not just being the neutral philosopher who's saying, hey, I'm not going to tell you anything about myself, but I'm going to set out to solve all these problems in philosophy and logic, like Kant. My very mode of existing, behaving, questioning, thinking, it's not the cognito either, I think, therefore I am. It's not Parmenides being in thought, partaking of one another, a great mystery. I know Gordon in his group, maybe here, but not to, and Paul, you're Greek too, not to diminish the immense complexity and why that's important for Heidegger and Lilly, right? But that's not being explicitly stated here. The mode of behaving and acting is already this built into this question of the questioner posing being. And these are constitutive, not like a constitution or something juridical. Again, what does it mean to say all those ways of being are constitutive of Dasein? It's going to show up later in this following page. So, and don't assume anything about Dasein. And don't even assume the translation being there, because it's certainly not being as a spot. On that material ontology of spatiality for Derrida, the tracing that doesn't point back to an original reference, I can tell you, oh yeah, that's how Pythagoras, that's exactly how he came up with that thing. But it's there. It's now something that is irrefutable. We're under its dominion, yet it can't tell us about its origin. And we can't find it in our own minds. We're going to have to engage with text and historicity. But this is not historicism and relativism. This is about the origin of truth. What? What's going on with Derrida? Okay, this very, and as such, it gets its essential character from what is inquired about, namely being. So being is going to give to the questioner the question of being. Sounds very circular, right? This entity which each of us in himself is himself, and which includes inquiring. So, okay, so we're all this Dasein, maybe individually, but not as an individual vis-a-vis society or the whole. We have many possibilities, but inquiring is one of them. Division two, death is a possibility. Not perishing, biologically dying, physically demising, body ending, flatlined, near-death experience, come back, dead, get buried, people are witnessing, attesting to that. But as a possibility to be, as a way of being. What? That's your definition of death, Alec? What are you talking about? But inquiring. So this entity that's posing the question to which the thing that's being questioned about being is going to give itself to be questioned is this Dasein. If we were to formulate our question explicitly and transparently, let's first give a proper explication of an entity of Dasein in its own being. As you move along, it's going to turn out Zorga, care, the whole stretch of life is what's the being of Dasein. What's that rooted in? The facticity of death, certainty, indefiniteness, we don't know when, because it's not linked to linear time in that way. Non-relational, I can't take Paul's death. I can push you out of the way, Paul, when the bus is coming about to hit you. You can survive, but I'm the one that has to die. So I don't literally take your death away. That radical individuation and the uncanniness of it exposes us as thrown into the world to try to understand everything, not from our finite perspective because we're relativistic, but that is the true grounding of the question of the meaning of being. Wow, okay. So Dasein suddenly is not some character here in the whole story that turns out to be the main character. It has a being. It's grounded in being. But as the questioner of the question, taking the path, is there not, however, manifest circularity in such an undertaking? We're all perplexed by the question of being. We're not going to repose it like what is being and try to answer it. We got to get to the meaning of the question. We're going to formulate the question. We're going to really work on that question. Hey, let's get some clarity here. All of us as a group, don't just assume anything and don't impose it. I'm not going to impose this on Paul. We're going to work this out. But he's saying, in order to work it out, I'm already going to presuppose this entity, Dasein. So what's going on here? We must first define an entity in its being to formulate the question of being on this basis. Isn't this going in a circle? And working out our question, have we not presupposed something which only the answer can bring? Question of being, want to know what it is, what its meaning is, need this other entity to presuppose it, that's going to give it to us. Therefore, we're going to have to explain its being and describe it first so we can answer that question. And if you know the history of Heidegger and being in time, he doesn't answer the question. The analytic ends with two divisions. There's a third division that doesn't get included. There's a lot of discussion here early on of being in the world, care, actually death, history, engagement with the other philosophers about time, Aristotle, Plato, Augustine, Hegel. Boom, it ends. He doesn't get to the other half of the title, being. He doesn't get to time. He does a lot of things after being in time. This is going off a little bit back to Kant and Aristotle. Only at the very end, 1931, back to Hegel. But coming here, formal objections. Here's where he breaks this circle, and then we can end. Such as the argument about circular reasoning, which can easily be cited at any time in the study of first principles, are always sterile when one is considering concrete ways of investigating. What's this concretion here? When it comes to understanding the matter at hand, they carry no weight and keep us from penetrating into the field of study. And this is where I want to kind of end here because it's this footnote on the factish. And if we come back to your Bob and Paul in the Derrida text, but factually, there's no circle at all. There are many circles, subject and object. I think, therefore I am. Diltai. Human beings are the subject and object of history, or Marx. Made by history deterministically. We have that heritage. It formed us, like the modern age we live in, for example. We're the makers of history. Oh, we believe in ourselves as agents. Okay, a lot of people do that, but that's not what we're talking about. I think, therefore I am. Being and thought partake of one another. Kant's a little too thorny about the relationship between the intuition, about through our imagination when we receive a manifold, but the transcendental concepts we used to subsume, excuse me, the so-called object that we think we're trying to describe, time and the schematic relationship, the mediating relation as he talks about, the third that brings us together, very cloudy. It's a secret buried in as an art, buried in how our judgments even work. Heidegger's a smart guy. He exploits that right away in the introduction. You're going to see that come later, but we're not talking about that. Factically, okay, there's no circle. So what's going on here? And I'll end here. Factish. While this word can often be translated simply as in fact or as a matter of fact, instantiation, institutionalizing, we saw some of that language in Derrida. Well, in fact, this happens. That's not how you cross the street if you were to try that. That's not what that means. Not, I'm introducing a fact. The world is made up of, I don't want to misread Wittgenstein here on the open rooms of the Tractatus, but as a matter of fact, I think about those registers. Can often be translated as in fact, as a matter of fact. Adjective, factual statement. Hard to do this in English. Well, I guess, factually. As an adverb is characteristic of Heidegger's style that we shall, as a rule, translate it as either factical or factically, thus preserving its connection with an important noun, facticitate, thinghood, the material ontology of even the ideal realms, the beauty of science and metaphysics, to be honest here, Hegel's Geist, the divine nous in Aristotle, thought thinking it so. He names as God, Plato's forms. Beautiful things. They're not just, appearances or empirical entities. Thus preserving facticitate and keeping it distinct from tatsächlich, factual, and wirklich. This is very important. Actual. The actual is more possible than possible. Okay. And then lastly, we'll just stay here. This presupposing a being as a character of taking a look at beforehand, so in the light of its entities presented to us gives provision to articulate human being. This guiding activity of taking a look at being arises from the average understanding of being in which we always operate as long as we're in the world. Death will be no longer being in the world as a possibility that we're driven towards, but not like death dying, like a dying person, or unfortunately watching someone die. Always operate, in which in the end belongs the essential constitutional doctrine I said. And there the translators, I don't want to get into it now, but when you go into the Wesenverfassung and Verfassung about the Constitution, it's not, don't think of constituent states, like the state of one's health, the state of the nation. Is it the elements that go into, or is it the constituting event? Is it the internal architectonic? Is it the anatomy, the gross anatomy? I don't know, those are all ontic. But think about ways of being, the average understanding, how we already operate, thrown into the world. Even when you're alone, you can be an ascetic monk. The world is being cleared for you. Not in your mind mystically, that's religion. And not just the physical habitation of the monastery. but the comportment, the ways of being, things open up, things get cleared, not ready to hand or present at hand. Very real, and not real as an objective. Remember Derrida's problem of objectivity. Occultation, but anyway, the essential constitution. Okay, so how do we break this down? A good way, and I'll pause here. Time is a horizon for understanding being. Understanding of being is not ready-made, ready, present at hand, ready-made. I'm going to go to the store and find it. I have a presupposition, me as a being raising a question. This is the beginning of being in time. I have no idea what this entity questioning is in its being and its relationship to the question. And I apologize, it's just one last piece I need here, because it kind of relates to what we want to get at with Derrida in terms of returning and repetition and the Rückfrage and the back and forth limit. But look at here, if you can see this. In the question of being, meaning of being, entity that questions, guys, and questioner, formulating question, getting it right, being genuine, making sure it is the ground by which what arises is our clearing our understanding of not who we are as human beings, but our relationship to the question so we can have some transcendental understanding, even beyond the history of metaphysics and what it's told us about what it means to be a human being. Certainly not religion. But look at this. In the question of the meaning of being, there's no circular reasoning, but rather a remarkable relatedness, backward or forward, which what we're asking about being bears to the inquiry itself as a mode of being of the entity. And here, what is asked about has an essential pertinence to the inquiry itself, and thus belongs to the own most meaning. Eigenstein's in even says something radically special about this, a priority. What we want to get at, folks, is as we move along in Derrida, temporality deference, the movement of deconstruction. Not the relation between subject and object, but historicity, writing, so many different names that Derrida is going to come up with. Here for Heidegger, it's also this kind of relationship backward and forward, not just between the question of being and Dasein the poser, Dasein's being, care and temporality, time as a reference. That looks like, man, there's a back and forth relation here that's going to go on. This sounds unnecessarily abstract. To bring it back to something more concrete, we can ask ourselves, maybe it's not fair when you ask this question, why? Why do we have to work so explicitly, carefully, genuinely, transparently on the question of the meaning of being? Why is Derrida talking? Why is Derrida talking about responsibility for the sense of a proper investigation, not just into origins of geometry? I'm going to stop here. Origins in general. You think of origin, think of a point in time. You think of something that can be made present. Why both thinkers are concerned about this authentic way into the question. Stop there. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. Geez, it took 3 minutes. Apologize. How do people want to come into this? Take it in a different direction too. Zach,
Yeah, I might just start by trying to answer the question you just posed. At least my take on it is that wanting to have a, I guess, authentic understanding of being it provides like the grounds for that are kind of still missing today in at least in the social sciences, um, which in terms of its ontology, I mean, it's just all over the place. There's not a lot of agreement, right? Um, and so I think also because we have to work in language, right? That's the way that we can convey um, the answer to the question, but we have to go back to kind of formulating what the question is before we can get to that point. And so being is that origin and it provides those grounds. Um,
Well, the analogy to the sciences could be the social sciences, which I know you're in. That part about the theoretical and practical activity, and Derrida says we're not going to go there because we got to get back to being in the world and relating to the world and meaning and sense responsibility. And here's Heidegger opening up. Do you pose this question in the social sciences? Hey, folks, stop what you're doing. Everybody, stop what you're doing. Let's reorient ourselves to the question here of what we're even doing.
I do, and people don't like that. I mean, they really
Oh,
don't,
that's
you know.
awesome.
Maybe that's why nobody's publishing my article, but
No, we have a big international group here, and people have some, places. We're all going to work together here. Okay, that's amazing, Zach. Thank you for sharing. Sai.
Um, yeah, it's actually quite a very difficult question to answer. Like, why must we question being or the meaning of being? And the answer Heidegger gives, at least later on, is that um, the question of being, or why must we question being, is precisely because it is in our nature to struggle out of this everyday understanding that we have of things. So the notion of strife becomes a central notion when it comes to questioning being as well as the meaning of things. Later, when he gives his lectures on Hölderlin, where it is in our nature to struggle against the everydayness and our everyday understanding of things that we are immersed in. And it is in the struggle out of this everydayness we get to know being at all, and we try to question it. And he then talks about the worlding of the world, the struggle between the world and the earth, where we constantly slip from meaning to non-meaning, and then we try to retrieve meaning again from it. So this notion of strife becomes quite central in his later works. And he
Yeah,
says we must
please.
question being because we need to engage.
Sai, that's such an important intervention, and it's great to bring in the later. But think about the earlier too, the phenomenology on religious life, Pauline Christianity, early church, primordial temporality, Christian religiosity is lived temporality, big static structure he's getting at. Not just the awaiting of the second coming, but the strife and the struggle not to be deceived and be authentic. Something's going on in the early seconds for sure. The mystics and the strife, although that's not named here, it's not like it's a tranquilization moment right here. Um, the word struggle for sure, but like you said even the average way of understanding, if you just want to go along with being present and flow with things and not question, that's okay. People do that all the time. But it's that occasional moment of like, oof, you're awake, you're not dreaming, you're not having a nightmare. It's just uncanniness of, am I really here? Like even in being in my body, or my racial categorization, and a lot of you come from a lot of different contexts where that doesn't apply, but here in the US, there's a lot going on right now. It has been historically forever, but this kind of like, mummification of being categorized as such and being, and then seeing yourself as such, because that's what the structure tells you you are. The uncanny is just saying, wait a minute, or the arbitrary continues, it could have been born something else. Or, you know, it's not just sort of a debilitating depressive mode of like paralyzed depression and not being able to do something, but just sort of like that very occasional moment of, whoa, am I really me? I don't even know who I am. And I'm sick of being me. Or I never subscribed to this. And in fact, I'm deluding myself. So you can go down all these other paths too. But the point is that thrownness, that is pure nakedness, I'm using that as a metaphor, of total absolute exposure with no mediation or filtration between yourself and everything else. There's so many ways to get at it, but you're right. Strife is not appearing here, but it's certainly being lifted out of the ordinary when you're in the ordinary itself. It's not a dialectical problem either. Yassine, and let's
Yeah,
I'll step away if others just want to keep jumping in.
yeah. Before I want to raise a point, I would just like to share the struggle that Zach mentioned about social scientists.
Oh, good.
Oftentimes, our colleagues don't like these kind of questions. Um, about that question of why care about that question of being, one sentence really resonated with me when Heidegger said, "But even if we ask what is being, we keep within an understanding of the is, though we are unable to fix conceptually what that is signifies." And to me, that was really compelling because it has something very ordinary, mundane in it, but at the same time very fundamental, almost like Orwellian, who like what's in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle. So that was something that really was
This is the
compelling to me.
this is the
Yeah,
passage.
exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, that's the problem with the verb. We're constantly using it. We keep an understanding of the
So,
is, though we're not able to conceptually fix what it is. You know, he gets around the circle too because he says, look, people are constantly defining entities and therefore presupposing being because we assume that they are. And we want to know what they are in their being because that's what we describe things. We essentially want to describe something. Social sciences, sciences, everybody's, the facts that we accumulate about things to get an understanding. Hey, that's what that is. We use it, but we also assume it. But and you don't need a concept. Nobody, social scientists don't have to use philosophical concepts in their presuppositions when they talk about the things that exist. But they're going around accumulating a lot of knowledge about a lot of things that can be very complicated. Economists do it. You're right. But this vague understanding of being is still a fact. Remember that fact problem? That's what allows us to even get into this. This may justify later the coming of Dasein, named as being in the world, because that's what that average understanding includes. And yet we have it's a complete mystery for Heidegger. That's what's so amazing, how he starts to look. Michael.
Yeah, thanks. So as I mentioned before, I was fascinated by the way you were talking about responsibility to reading history as a form of care and perhaps even of ethics. And so I really appreciated, calling attention to that line in Derrida, where he says, taking consciousness of origins is at the same time to make yourself responsible to the meaning of science and philosophy. It's to increase clarity, and it's remplissement. I don't know how you translate that. And to take the measure of responding to the partie de sens. I'm not sure how that's translated. And the totality of our existence. It just that really clarified for me what the stake is for you in reading Derrida here. And then is that it? No.
This is the English translation. It sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's responsibility. So essentially, the total sense of existence, you said totality. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you for highlighting that. And then secondly, just in rereading Being in Time for the first time in a really long time, it's really great to see some of the expressions here that show up in the middle and later Heidegger. I think to Sai's point, like es gibt, Wesenhaft, Betroffenheit, Wesen and other notions that become articulated so much more substantially, as I know them, at least in the Beiträge. But it and strife, of course, is in there as well. But a question for me, and I'd like to hear more of, and I don't think you need to cover it right here, right now. But why being in time? Since so much of what is in Derrida, at least, seems to come out of the later Heideggerian notions of historicity, Geschicklichkeit, and Schicken, and all those notions that are articulated, if somewhat inchoately, in the Beiträge and some of the later Heidegger works. Why being in time?
You know, Michael, the French intellectual historians will tell you, and even this 1965 lecture that was published in Chicago, the work that they're doing to translate the unpublished lectures, which we see the engagement with being in time. The story we're told is that the French didn't get the full translation until much later. I mean, the English translation is 1962. There's another translation, Spanish, a couple. Um, more recently too. And then there's a new English translation coming out by an individual. I'm trying to understand who that is. I heard this, but Stambaugh was another translator of the later Heidegger. It's interesting. Somehow the later Heidegger gets to, as you said, to the French before even the earlier in Being and Time. But that's not the full sense of it. I think what's uncanny here is even if he didn't have access to the full translation of Being and Time, and the discussion in Division 2 about historicality, which you already had there, before it morphs into whatever we see in the later Heidegger, the history of being, for example, the sendings of being, the destining of being. What we have here with both thinkers early on is, can't we say this post Nietzsche? You got a problem with the West, certainly Western metaphysics, not because of what we're told later about domination and technicization and modernity and Heidegger's re-engagement with Nietzsche on nihilism, Hölderlin as a possibility for getting us out of the saving power out of the danger, and how we think about the clearing and passage to the other beginning. But something is woefully, genuinely, I'd say there's such a delicacy going on in both thinkers early on to try to take care of the problem of truth. It's not even named here. That's not the question of being, but the problem of truth for the Western Dasein, which is not to assume any kind of history of science and metaphysics as being able to take care of that question, but to take care of, if you can include me as a Western-based person, to take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
Like, who's going to do it? Who's going to be responsible?
Yeah.
Your teachers in high school teaching you math, or is it President Trump in his speech yesterday? If you heard that horrific.
No.
Could you stick with it? And for those of you that are on the outside, just, if you want to subject yourself, you can have a good laugh, but I mean, it's horrifying. So to take care in the circle as the being of Dasein for the allotment of the life is an individual problem. But if you're going to extend that out to the allotment of history of the logocentric and phallocentric pillars of this Eurocentric racism, that's the opening of grammatology. That's also a repudiation right at the start. Like, he's calling it out. I'm going to link it up with all kinds of stuff. But this predominance of speech, self-sameness in the subject, being present, and this priority of the logos as part of this Eurocentric dominion that's kind of held us in captivity, at least for 500 years. You can think of it as colonization, to his case in 1960. It's closing now. Yeah, closing. It's closed, but it's not ending. So it's a reorientation. Yeah, no complete translation. Thank you, Maxine. 80s.
But they could read German. I mean, come
Not
on.
not all. And what do you mean by reading? The
Better
Germans
than
are not reading
Americans.
German. Well, no, but I mean, Gadamer maybe, but who's reading Heidegger in German and doing something with it?
Derrida. In 1963 and 1964, Derrida gave a series of seminars on Heidegger, in which he draws extensively on Being and Time, including the passage we just read. I think it's in the second lecture in this series. So he must have read it then. That's 63, I guess that began.
How about Levinas is in World War II?
So I think he read it in German. I guess he read Husserl in German as well.
Yeah, otherwise, it's just eerie how much he's been able to come up with here just on the basis of a reading of Husserl, which is in German. So to me, it speaks to a facility on Derrida's part with both the Being and Time era Heidegger and perhaps even some of the later work. It's spooky how much comes up here. Occultation, the notion of history, the problematization of history. History is not, a sequence of facts stringing back into the past. It's extraordinary.
By the way, don't forget Levinas, 1931, very early encounter with both Husserl and Heidegger, translating between German and Russian as a prisoner of war. So, the facility with the German is not what's at stake here. It's the verisimilitude, or across two different generations, 1927, 1962, this return. So there you go, about the need to take care be responsible for an attestation, which is going to come out in later Heidegger about conscience. But all of metaphysics, like here we are as a group, we care. And no one else seems to care. No one, Derrida is not really cared for if you think about it. I mean, he was appropriated and deployed and was so influential for the Anglo-American humanities. His status today, there's a Derrida Today group, Paul, you know about that. But we can open the space up now, but what people want to say about Heidegger and what's happening to him inside Europe and also our Anglo-American context because of the notebooks and the politics around that, the debates since 1914, both the unconscious dismissal of the whole project of Heidegger, which the analytics started, but internally the infighting of the continental Heideggerians about being and about the future of the scholarship and what's the priority, is it the early and the late and the failure? Oh, but then we're attending to the Nazi question as well, but we got to apologize. No, we don't apologize. No, all that, it's happening. But let's take a step back. Let's suspend epoche and reduce for a moment and try to understand the parallel here that we're getting back to the origins of meaning and sense in general. What's bigger and more necessary than that? Previn, I think, or is it? Yeah, please.
Hi, Raj. Yeah, I think picking up from what Paul said earlier about de jure, de facto in Derrida, it seems that the ghost of Kant is hovering over both these texts,
Sure.
and yet his name isn't mentioned. The whole thing about de jure, de facto is the first question that Kant asks in Critique of Pure Reason, putting reason on trial and asking why does reason make claims to ideas that go beyond experience, go beyond the fact. What is it in us that has a need to do that? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Kant's got quite a complicated response to that with part two of the dialectic, and amphiboles and antinomies and all that kind of stuff. But the question is there already in Kant, that both of Derrida and Heidegger come at it different ways. What I find interesting and difficult is that Derrida seems absolutely clear that there is no facticity. We can talk about historicity, we can just about talk about the object, but facticity for him is clearly a site of interrogation. So he is very clear that what he's doing is epistemological, and he's asking the question, how do we know what we know? And he's kind of clear on that, and that kind of aligns him to Kant. Heidegger keeps repeating the question of being, which is ontological, even though he doesn't get to being. And he relies on facticity, and he says, oh, it's self-evident, but actually it's not. But it's there, but it's not. But it's here and it's not. And it could be there and it's not. And I'm just wondering why Heidegger appears to have got stuck in an ontology, which Derrida seems to escape in this epistemological, I know the question is, we've got to figure out how we know what we know. Which of course is Kant's.
Right. But it's not so much Derrida repetition. I don't see it purely as epistemology. I think he's talking about universal historicity here. That's not being made a problem phenomenologically, and he's going to undertake that. But what that means is a total reevaluation, not only of phenomenology as a project, but therefore the need for him to go create everything he's going to go create. And he's going to take it into psychoanalysis. He's going to take it into speech and writing. Quite frankly, he's an encounter with Rousseau and Levi-Strauss, structuralism. But he's sort of like he's desedimenting the very grounds that make it possible, not epistemology as the conditions by which we know, which can be Kantian. But you were spot on. That's why I brought up Kant now for both of them. It's not just putting reason on trial. The correction of the errors in this pursuit, which is going to take him to the next critiques, right? And freedom and judgment is what transcendence is about. That's what makes it so great. It's not like we're like, okay, we're going to admit that we can't answer our questions in metaphysics and we're all stuck. But it's a Copernican turn. They all recognize that. It's, that's the rupture that Kant represents. Foucault says in the order of things. It's not so much another great breakthrough in the history of philosophy. It's complete radical reordering of what we should be making as our priority in our use of reason. It's in self-investigation. Yeah, that does come about. I'm not sure about that clear. You're right about the ambivalence and the back and, even what you're saying, like, oh, it's evident, it's not. Oh, it's average, but it's not. It's this, but it's uncanny. Authentic and authentic. Derrida, and not just him, Levinas and other figures will go to town on these types of binary distinctions. And a lot of us then debate whether they're successful in doing so because they have to assume a lot in their understanding of every major aspect of Heidegger's thought before they attempt to deconstruct it. But Derrida is going to do that very same thing in trying to differentiate his difference, deferral and differentiation, the event of that, and the tracing of that, and the erasure of that, and the production of it as a movement in every text in metaphysics, Lucia from this kind of static architectonic of the ontological difference, being and beings. Okay, for that, in order for the history of metaphysics to begin, this distinction has to be forgotten. But what the hell does it? Derrida loves to play with that aporia. And you might say, well, Heidegger just assumes it and doesn't do anything with it, which is not true, if you ask me. But to get to your point, how do I think Nisarga and Sai want to come in, but I'm not sure if Derrida is ready to just say every fact or even facticity as a state is a site of conflict interrogation here. That's my reading. You can make that claim for later, but let's see. A Sai and a Nisarga.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
why does Heidegger get? Oh, sorry. Could I just quickly follow
I'm
up?
sorry. Yeah, sure, please.
Just so why does Heidegger get stuck in ontology rather than epistemology?
Well, here's the interesting thing. That's not, well, it depends. Division, we have to get to it, but Division 1, Chapter 5, for sure, on discourse and speech and rhetoric, and then when we get to truth itself and propositions, and the critique of logic in Chapter 6, which is the chapter on care, and then this very intricate labyrinthine connection of many different things in Division 2. So I wouldn't say that, and some might tell you, Pravin, that he doesn't even do ontology. He's now stuck with his existential analytic of Dasein as a preparatory step to even then frame what the project of fundamental ontology is, which the works after 1926 attempt to do in different ways. Kant books, Basic Problems of Phenomenology, Leibniz book, and it's kind of ending by 1929, 30. Becomes the rector at Freiburg, and the analyses in 33 takes a break, and then the so-called turning to the later period begins. But fundamental ontology, I don't know if people would even call that. Because in our project here, a Derridean parallel with being and time, let's not assume anything about Dasein. With Derrida, there is no mention. There's no starting. That's how it ends here. It's difficult to recognize a starting point in a phenomenological reduction. There's a total suspension of everything, and yet we're there. And boom, in a way, kind of thrown into that historicity, but there's a return movement and reversal. And when we get to the later end of the text, things like transcendentality and the absolute, and quite frankly, God show up. So logos, and then deconstruction kind of appears. It's a kind of divine messianic problem of this occultation. I guess what I'm getting out of the aporia and Derrida is don't turn to human beings telling you about how great the history of their knowledge is. Not how we know things or don't know things or how does science ground itself, because scientists aren't going to tell you that. The whole thing is just this uncanny display, and we're coming to it and encountering it. And the same with Heidegger is that this question, you don't even assume anything about this question. Let's do the work of formulating. Most people want to pose a question and start looking for the answer. And he's like a squirrel burying himself into it, and he brings this presupposition of Dasein, which he then says looks circular, but then he wants to break that because he has a relationship here. Dasein is a relation of being. Being is transcendence, the medieval category, but is radical individuation, which is the existential project. It's phenomenological truth disclosed, as it become at the end of the introduction. And even there, it'll show up. It's named later. It's not care. The meaning of Dasein's being is temporality. static temporality, primordial finite unified ecstatic temporalizing, clearing, showing, self-revealing. Maybe for you, Kant and the time forming in the schematism, which Heidegger will come back to. I'm sorry I took up so much space here, but I'm going to stop
Thank
here.
you very much. Thanks.
I don't have the answers. I'm just trying to throw it back out there. Sai and Nisarga, you may have the answer.
Yeah, so just to respond to Michael, the reason why being in time and why not other texts or even the later texts for that matter. I'm often reminded of Levinas's famous article in Le Nouvel Observateur in '84, where he finishes the article by saying that, can we be sure that there was nothing problematic with being in time? Is the project of fundamental ontology by itself negligent of ethics or even the possibility of ethics in that sense? Most often it's the case that people tend to blame Heidegger's abysmal politics later on to his shift away from fundamental ontology towards a more historical thinking of the folk and being itself. But Levinas was quite observant in that sense when he pointed out in the article that, can we be assured that there was no problem from an early text such as being in time as well? Or is the problem merely in Heidegger's historical thinking later, or do we have traces of his bad politics from being in time as well? So yeah, I think we must revisit being in time in that sense to try to answer Levinas's question.
Agreed.
That's it. Then Sai and Michael, guess what? Chapter 2 on resolve, Geschlossenheit, Division 2, the section on conscience and care and calling. It's a beautiful, delicate revelation. He'll give us all these arguments against the psychologistic versions of conscience, the ontic history of it, Nietzsche's critique of it too. It's just pain and repetition and beating the beast, so you have a memory. You know, the best thing is to be able to have the power to forget. Without that, you're not going to have your good and bad distinction. Then the priestly classes that come in and take their asceticism, they leverage their power hypocritically to like form you into someone who can't question their own values. We won't go down Nietzsche, but the conscience is wanting to choose to have a conscience, taking responsibility, caring, not just for yourself, but the Mitdasein, Michael, is the Fürsorge. Zach is social welfare is mentioned. We're going to get to that in Division 1. The Nazi is saying, proto-Nazi before he's a declared one, is saying something about the absolute concern, not a social contract, but our relationship with things and others in the world, towards which we comport ourselves already as that average understanding. Remember that? Linking this part, the beginning, with what's to come. The worst thing you can do is start with your own eye. This sounds like an Eastern perspective on the world, like Eastern philosophy. The selfishness of that Western ego or I. This is coming out of Heidegger.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Nisarga.
Yeah, so I was just thinking of speaking of the background of Heidegger, like his background in German mysticism, right? So the idea of the question, sort of also going apology. I apologize for sort of also like jumping ahead towards late Heidegger, where he comes back to his early origins in mysticism, right? So the idea of the question, as in the fact that we should like particularly with Eckhart, right? So it's sort of taking from Eckhart that we all have this responsibility to ask the question, which is the responsibility that Derrida goes back to. That we have this responsibility to ask the question, but at the same time, it's like you must respect the question. So you should not presume to know the answer at the same time, right? So I'm reminded of that. So I was actually also wondering if, does Derrida maintain that same kind of respect, or does he think of like we should like in that sense also undo the respect or like get into some kind of disrespect towards that question? I don't know. Yeah, that's what I was thinking, because it's binary, or this like you both have the question, you must have the question. It's responsibility, but it's also care towards being. To have the question is to care for being. but also we mustn't presume to know the answer. So that's what I was thinking about. Maybe later on we can get to like late Heidegger. I'm just jumping a bit forward with
No, the
this.
saga, that's incredible. But it's also the early Heidegger on that card. But then Derrida, which we have to get to, it might take years to get to that because it's later in the corpus. But I'm wondering, Paul, speaking in the apocalyptic tone of philosophy, or no, it's the denials. Anyway, it's a direct engagement with Heidegger, and Eckhart does come up, as does the Tower Battle and other figures. He's also talking about Heidegger's The Thing. That's much later at Derrida. But if you're referring to Eckhart, because you have to put it back in not just the medieval Christian context, but I got to take away the idea of God from me in order for me to approach God, that his paradoxes, like, which is kind of like a taking responsibility. And here he is doing it in that, a dense Christian context. For someone like him, it would be the kenosis. It'd be all the mysteries of Christianity. Don't assume the dogma and the principles and the pictorial representations and the rituals and the repetitions and the sterile sort of like proclamations, but it's just you got to enter that space. He does it as a mystic and a thinker, but as do many other early fathers. Not early, he's an early fathers medieval, but if you look at the early church fathers, Greek and Latin. But for Heidegger, even being as transcendence as something like the Godhead is a problem already here. It's stated explicitly. Theology is also, in its attempt to talk about being as transcendence, is still ontic. And so the pre-comprehension and the pre-orientations, again, how am I going to even, regardless of what religious upbringing I have, where am I being there as the precipice before I fall into that space of trying to account for the anxiety of my own finitude, like Kierkegaard. So what would be the step prior to even that showing up as something for me to care about? Not because I'm an atheist or I hate it or other phrases approaching something more about. That I think there's something similar between the two here because it turns out the question of the meaning of being is temporality, folks. And I hate to put the end at the beginning, but both thinkers are going to come down to it shows up here, chapter 2, primordial temporality in the duration of the transmission of sense, or what we did in the very beginning, transmission and heritage. Same thing with Geschichtlichkeit, repetition, handing down the tradition, taking it over, appropriating, making those decisions. Maybe both come down to this idea of reinventing the idea of care in a profoundly ontological way. They both take it at different moments at different times from different great thinkers. They may find it in Plato and Aristotle, for sure.
And I take your point, Raj. There is and this I'm just using regular English here, but there's a concreteness to the Dasein analytic in being in time that is paradigmatic for Heidegger. He really doesn't go any deeper into it or more comprehensively into it elsewhere in this entire, at least as I'm aware, unless things have been published in the last 10 years in the Gesamtausgabe I'm not aware of. But I mean, this is it as far as, a full exploration of what it means to be human in that particular sense of Dasein. And just to say to Sai, because I don't want to appear that I'm pro-Nazi here, but I agree. We have to look at the entirety of what he's written here, and there are roots of both the good and the bad from the very, very beginning. Even if you go back to the very early lectures prior to being in time, you could see the same tendencies to mysticism, the same tendencies to in the bad sense of the word, a collective notion of the people. I mean, it's there,
It
and
wouldn't be hard to trace. But
yeah,
Michael and others, have people read the English translations of the Black Notebooks? Because there are now 6 of them. They began in German and in the translation 2014.
no, I haven't looked at it in English. No, I mean it's
I think you
some of
might.
it's ugly, and so you just have to face it. So
We haven't even gotten those areas yet. With starting without spirit. Maybe if it's earlier, people can tell me. But certainly thereafter, Derrida constantly having to respond once and looked into it. But yeah, I mean, when you say concreteness, it's this problem of facticity and facticité as opposed to the factual or actual. And Previn was got the key insight about, well, the suspension is so radical at that point because of this question of speech and writing and subjectivity, not just the Lacanian registers, but this mystery of signification itself, which was a problem for Husserl phenomenology, but the other big guy is Husserl, as you know, those of you that know that route to Derrida, is that the formation of the signs is completely arbitrary in the relationship between the signifier as the speech or the word, and then the mental object that corresponds to it and the signified. So in other words, the signified is just a deferral of more signifiers buried as traces that shows up in grammatology. So he's going to come in Derrida and explode that in a way, not just the arbitrary nature of the sign forming out of the two in language that when it evolves or changes and relates its in the process of translation having to relate itself to other languages. What's that gap? But I mean, at least if we can walk away with this, can I just bring this back here about the? And sorry if I'm not looking at the chats. It's what people make of this. Here's an overturning. I mean, geometry is supposed to be this ideality, and Previn for your Kant, it's the roundness of the plate that most people can understand as what the circle is, not the deployment of the concept that can merely be intuited in an idea of a circle without actually seeing it, which would be the sensible. And yet, even within that, the mixture there's within the circle is an ideal structure without seeing it on the page, but just to think it in its purity, there is an admixture, and that's why he calls that the third category of this schematism. How does this assumption occur? And he's not clear. He doesn't clear it up there, and Heidegger's going to exploit that eventually. But here we got something else being said, which is, I don't know if someone said that. Let me just read this whole paragraph here. The anteriority of the formal transcendental logic in relation to the problem of origin. Oh, Paul, there's your juridical. For the other sciences has a systematic and juridical significance. And Previn, maybe it is the illusion to Kant. The necessary anteriority first arrives from the nature of traditional logic, which is always presented as a general theory of science, as the science of science. And he doesn't name it here, he names it earlier, but the science of logic, Hegel, if that's what he wants to also, like Heidegger, throw Hegel back into the tradition. Hegelians, and quite frankly myself, say that's easier said than done if you really want to take on Hegel. The statement also refers to the hierarchy of all ontologies or elaborating ideas where materially determined ontologies are subordinated to formal ontology, which treats the pure rules of objectivity in general. But then he goes and names geometry is a material ontology whose object is determined as the spatiality of the thing belonging to nature. What does 14 say? It is clearly recognized that it is the essence of a material thing to be a res extensa, point, line, plane, extension, and that consequently geometry is an ontological discipline relating to an essential phase of such thinghood, Dinglichkeit, the spatial form. That's pretty wild already in Husserl, and he wants to pick up on that. Formal ontology, the rules of objectivity in general, okay, fine. Logic as the science of thinking, science comprised of rules, okay. But geometry is a material ontology whose objects general spatial thing belonging to nature. Previn.
Yeah, that question of the investigation on page 32 of Derrida, the bottom line of the first paragraph, and he's talking about, he cites Husserl, these investigations considering the possible sense and possible method of genuine science as such, are naturally directed, first of all, to what is essentially common to all possible sciences. And it's the next bit. They should be followed secondarily by corresponding sense investigations for particular groups of sciences and single sciences. So my reading of that is Husserl is saying actually every science is resting on a particular sense. And that's going to determine how we investigate. Are we going to use logic? Are we going to use reason? Are we going to use intuition? And that question of sense investigations prior to the claims of knowledge seems to me what Derrida gets completely, that we are dealing with the construction of knowledge, not the ontology of being. So Derrida's locating the problem in such a different place. And the thing about sense investigations, of course, the transcendental deduction chapter in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is the whole breakdown of the senses that we use in the construction of knowledge. And Kant makes that distinction between understanding, which is a faculty that constructs the object in space and time, and reason, which is completely different, hence the Critique of Pure Reason, which has ideas outside of space and time.
Right.
And Kant is then trying to give an account of that. But I think Derrida kind of gets it, but he's not wanting to engage in science in Kant, but he kind of sees the problem of knowledge is the problem of Heidegger Husserl. And Heidegger and that's hence my question, Heidegger just seems so stuck in the ontic. It's like he takes a step back and then goes back into it. And I guess the question about his mysticism may have some reason to why he was there, but it's very bizarre because, Derrida's in a completely different place for me.
Well, these distinctions, it's interesting. First of all, the logical investigations is what's so key for both Heidegger and eventually all the French from the 1930s, Levinas, those generations through the 50s, before Derrida was this kid, I guess, he was being formed, but then he just launches by 1961, 62, then he's off, doing his thing, creating the stuff. But this issue of sense and nonsense, the grammatical structure, these are the 6 investigations, parts in the whole, the temporal duration of consciousness, so many different facets of it. But the main thing was that wiseness. How does the distinction between sense and nonsense even arise without assuming a priori that there are rules to human beings, for example, versus animals when it comes to language ability? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about just the phenomenological apprehension of how you make sense of something, not because it's given as a thing, as the content of meaning is already prevalent, especially in the text, if you want to interpret it, but anything. If you want to really go that far, like whatever the heck you're looking at, oh yeah, it's just got written all over itself. It's going to tell you everything about itself. No, that requires our intending to it. But then in being drawn towards it, we're suspending even what that thing is in terms of our immediate senses and intuitions. Hence, it's a method. It's a process. That's very important for Derrida and deconstruction. He talks about that. But you're saying here too, to investigate sense. But in fairness to Heidegger, it's not just he may talk about understanding, but then he says meaning, as in the Bedeutung, which the translators, McCoy Robinson, always say, is it the sense of, genuine sense of the matter of fact. We're in it, we know we're in it, but we're not conceptualizing it because that's not what we're doing at that moment. But unless you have an uncanny relationship to that moment where you're not doing something and it gets to death, you're not really concerned about it. Or you're overly concerned about it because you got that ontic conception of ending because you saw a relative pass. And suddenly at that moment, you're concerned about your mortality. A radical Heideggerian interpretation, and many scholars try to take that approach, and some, is that even that ontic understanding of the certainty of death because you just experienced a loss, profound mourning and loss of someone else, brings it back to you, is not the authentic way back into your own finitude, because you're just sort of looking at something on the outside. And he says we can draw lessons from that. And there is some importance for that, for medical knowledge and for palliative care and geriatrics and, and stage ethical approaches to that. He even says that, but that's not going to be the individual Dasein because it's still something present to him, both the corpse and also what we imagine religiously or philosophically as the meaning of that for us and what comes after. That's all wanted. That's not the ontological project. But it's radically individuated uncanniness of being thrown in the world. And the only way we're going to ever get to not no longer being in the world is the moment of death. But guess what? We don't get to pass through it. We're not lifted out of it. Resurrection, Christ on the cross. And we certainly can't come back to tell. But that total exasperation of no more possibilities, which is not literally imagining anything you can think of with regard to your own death. You can draw on a lot of, maybe draw on religion, or maybe you draw on the near-death experience, or you can talk to maybe someone who came back from that flatline, or you are then talking about in some kind of communal or familial or religious sense the memory of the death of the other. That none of that applies to this relationship between time, yourself, your finitude, the transcendence of that radical freedom of wanting to have that anxiety and being anxious and ready for that moment of vision. That's going to come later. So sense, in other words, there's a point where Heidegger even invokes this, where he says he doesn't even use facticity. He talks about the truth of existence as the stretched whole of Dasein from birth to death as a movement that's ontological in nature, as one big event, which itself is determined by some kind of primordial temporality. And not to get too deep into that, but he talks about coming towards having been, and you could deconstruct a lot of ontic registers of that. It's not so much like, okay, well, I just right now I'm alive, want to fantasize. Maybe I need a little reassurance right now and feel good about myself. Oh, what are my friends going to say at my funeral? Like, what kind of music are they going to play? What are they going to say about me? They're going to say, oh, yeah, he was this and that, and blah, blah, blah. That's not what he's talking about. It doesn't come from that future. And my having beenness in the eyes of others is also in the future, but I'm not there. And being gone and dead is not the past in an authentic way because I'm already that past, not because I get dragged along, but if I have to drag it along, it's determining me. But he also wants to know what it means to be towards that. So it's not clear. None of that is clear in Division 2, and the whole thing collapses. This whole thing is going to collapse on time in a radical new way. And that to me is remarkable for this Western project. And I say West because I don't want to reduce or exclude how the East is could come to this and also receive this. But what we find in Heidegger and Derrida, at least, is a radical questioning in terms of how time is understood, but also the relationship between being and time, the secrets and influence. Maybe that's racing ahead, but you tell me. I don't know. Levinas is there, Blanchot is there, quite frankly, Merleau-Ponty, but in a more Husserlian way. But Husserl is the bigger figure from 1930 to 1960 until the more Heidegger is availed to. But by then, there's only Derrida's young enough to keep going, right? I mean, and the prior generation is dying or dead.
Yeah.
Okay, we're at about 10:20. If you don't want to discuss this now, let me know. Some feedback would be great, and maybe we can move it around if people. If you don't want to volunteer to introduce the text and lead the discussion, that's fine. But if you do, please let me know, and then we can go from there.
Okay, just something I like to add. Is it all right if I go for, like, I have a question?
Sure.
Yeah. I was thinking, like, can we also think of this as like Heidegger was rather like he was rather what should I say? He was cautious about like going into the ontic with his question. So even though for neither Derrida nor Heidegger God is there, but there's a sense of respect in Heidegger, and he says that let's not get down to the ontic, but Derrida is not afraid to get the dirty with the ontic as he's going into the question, um, and hence into the epistemological along with the ontological. Uh, can you think of this in this manner? I'm just like, yeah.
You can, and that's part of, I think, what Previn was saying too, or is it Michael or Previn? I'm trying to remember, but it's there, it's not there, it's evident, it's not evident. Remember in this section, he's going to get to this when we move along in the introduction, but Dasein, why is this the priority entity, first of all? We're not talking about the human subject, the subject-object Cartesian structure. Previn nicely summarized the Kantian problem, which is by no means reducible to what we might think is this simple matter about the self-correction of reason as a project. What does that mean for our freedom? And everything else that flows from Kant. But with Heidegger, Derrida played, when he says in a moment, okay, the ontological problem is the question of meaning of being. I got to start with this entity. It may look ontic because it's going to turn out to have all these human qualities to it, like conscience, like death, like guilt, like this and that, being with others, history. Derrida might exploit that by saying, why are you leaving the animals out? And of course, he's going to go off on his own thing with that. But so it looks human. But then there's a point where he goes, okay, if you want to call, because of that backwardness, forwardness, relationality, movement, event, question of being, the question of inquirer, the being of this entity, it's questioning, it's already operating, it's being in the world, and yet I want to conceptualize that, and yet I don't have the meaning. Answer the question of meaning being, there's time. So when he gets to this Dasein, okay, maybe this is, Dasein is like an object. When it takes the form of a human being, asking about human things, then of course that's an object thing, but it's still ontological. It's unique as an object entity because it's ontological in nature, which is why it has that relationship to the question. And then Derrida might come along and make fun of that. Like, well, if it's ontologically unique, if it's as an object entity, as you say, can you have that clear separation, Heidegger? Can you have a clear separation of the ontological difference? Derrida is coming in cleverly and saying, hey, put this back on you. Or also, like, you keep talking about authentic, finite, primordial, time, and you hit Plato and Aristotle and Bergson and everybody else. Hegel, linear time now points. You call that vulgar or inauthentic. But cleverly, as you move through Lucia and Brandeis, of course, all the other works, can you even make that claim? Thank you, Previn, for your great contributions. You don't have to go. But so Derrida is going to question binary distinctions, which it seems to me that's our takeaway here. Why is Heidegger rooted in ontology versus epistemology? What's going on with this ontological difference, ontology and ontic? What's the relationship between the question of being and Dasein? Why does he even have this character? You don't have that in Derrida.
I mean, I think that speaks to the importance of looking at the earlier Heideggerian works with an ethical ear, right? Because there is that derogatory tone around the ontic that is so problematic in Heidegger. I mean, the good part of it is it forces us to think about the meaning of being and the way that he articulates it. But the bad part is that there's an awful lot of real estate that gets perceived pejoratively as a result of that.
The ontic life story of Heidegger is not good, and for a lot of people in Germany in that time, especially his background, his rural conservative background. So it's just really a disaster, and if not, then he does live the life of that retribution and judgment and denazification. Certainly denazification.
Rightfully so. Rightfully
so. Yeah. The ontological question, though, is I think maybe this is our starting point philosophically. We all, if we're going to think philosophically, especially today, because a lot of us are suffering in different contexts, and the late Derrida was doing this. He was doing his whole life. It sounds like it starts here at the beginning, Paul. By the late 90s and early 2000s, where it's all about responsibility. Talk about Kantian cosmopolitanism and borders. It's already there in grammatology. The Eurocentric structure collapsing on itself. Well, he's an intersectional person. I mean, he's a guy that's facing multiple vectors of racialization, persecution, anti-Semitism, racialization as the dark North African. I mean, if I'm going to bring in the ontic, it's through this radical, it's a philosophically motivated radical critique that you see out of the Derrida in his context, coloniology. How that can possibly connect to an ethically responsible early Heidegger who is becoming a Nazi and then becomes a full-fledged Nazi.
Can I just make one point about language? It strikes me that a lot of the problems with Heidegger, going right back to the beginning, circulate around this question of authenticity. And I notice he uses various words to refer to that in this text that we just read, including genuine. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that in German, but including a word that's cognate with the French and the English. And this question of authenticity applies to the way he thinks about language, in particular about the verb be, that he seems to have some idea that there is a more authentic language that you can get to, and he associates that with ancient Greek and German as opposed to the Latin languages, for example, in a later work. And I wonder if this is not one of the key problems with Heidegger. We can't go into it now, but later on I'd like to discuss what Brandeis has to say about the question of being and the verb be in various languages, including languages that I presume Heidegger would regard as not addressing the question of being. No, I don't mean those modern languages which don't necessarily use an explicit copula for the verb to be, but languages, perhaps the majority of languages in the world and throughout history that don't do that. Where has the question of being been raised in those societies which don't use the verb to be with the same range of meanings that we do, or with none of them? These are questions, I think, which are very pertinent and which Derrida suggests, but Heidegger doesn't seem to address these at all.
Well, it's interesting, thank you, Paul, because we saw that responsibility in that moment in Derrida. We see intending here in this footnote 3, modifying the medieval intending but the medieval sense of intending is modified by autonomous. There's already built into that an ethical category. Ethic may not be the word, but you're genuine and authentic for Heidegger. If it's not going to be ontic, and still be ontological. He goes through pains throughout the entire work, even though we don't do ontology. It's existential analytic. It's this unique character that's ontic but ontological nature. And it's a mixture being in the world, and that's why he decided to talk about the things he does, as opposed to what Aristotle deals with in Nicomachean Ethics. But Aristotle takes us through a bunch of phases too before he gets to his contemplative life, the divine life of the philosopher. He always ends with that. That's how he ends in metaphysics too. And it's hard to get to that point because most people, it's in friendship or it's in contracts and a just person acting this way and out of the acting community, blah, blah, blah. Not to disparage those aspects of the ethics, but you're asking here genuine and authentic, eigenleash, and not just eigen, and the actualization, and then the proximity of eigen with algen, which will become important for the moment of vision, which could take, and then there's a footnote with the translators talking about the clairvoyance, Onmacht, which has a mystical trans component when we're getting to the album, but moment of vision. Knowing it's ready for its time, which is not the death moment biologically, but also the possibility of radical authentic existence against the day that descends on us all constantly and distracts us and messes us up. But this genuine, authentic, and responsible, Previn's on here. You can go back to Kant, but you might want to give it up to Husserl for both Heidegger and Derrida for initiating this project. Just by wondering. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think that's what the proximity of these texts that you put together for us, Raj, suggest. Either Derrida had secret access to the middle and late Heidegger that he didn't tell anybody about, or he legitimately pulled these ideas out of the origin of geometry and has come up with like 2/3 of the later Heidegger all on his own.
And Michael,
So
which one of those is more implausible? They both kind of scare me. That's like a weird.
I think the secret access one is completely ridiculous.
But no, but so is what about the other one? This is a Derridean move here. The other one's
well,
kind
because
of absurd too.
But access to the Gesamtausgabe was trickling out into the intellectual community at that point in time, and it's not beyond crazy to think that that stuff began to be reflected in the writing of Parisian intellectuals in the 60s, right? And so it's a concatenation of things where it's like, oh, wow, look at this stuff that somebody went and got access to the unprinted lecture notes here from Heidegger, and there's all this really interesting stuff in here, and that began to circulate. This is my conspiracy theory. Began to circulate in Parisian circles at the time, and so you have both post-structuralism, Derrida, Lacan, and a burgeoning understanding of what's available in the Heideggerian corpus there by virtue of the Gesamtausgabe all happening at the same time.
Well, here's my
and you get a genius in Derrida. I mean, that's the other thing.
If you want to, yeah. I mean, although he used to lecture about that, how bizarre that is for being encrypted in history while you're alive. And, I talk about genuine and kind of my encounters, which is like, very smart person, to say the least. But for someone that powerful and that famous to be that kind to the people that he encountered, like face to face, I don't know about, I've never met, wasn't around, but probably know with some. So the genuine practice what you preach is a maxim. The moral law of what you want for others to be, you will it for yourself. And this is special, but this question, I mean, this may sound like a polemic, but the Anglo-American trained Heideggerians from predominantly analytic structures did go after Derrida, not only in his treatment of Heidegger's German, but like in Aporius when Death came out. When Aporius came out in the early 90s, about finally Derrida speaks about Heidegger and death all over the place, but like Romeo and Juliet's a beautiful piece when he was asked to do it. But Aporia is where, okay, he's just going to stake on this possibility of impossibility, which is the definition to get out of Heidegger. And they like, well, Derrida, you're making mistakes logically with regard to what Heidegger, not only was he doing in the German, but they try to say that, okay, it's even in this attempt to translate or receive, either that's wrong, or there's a mistake in your thinking or logic with regard to how we have to understand what Heidegger is saying, but also how it fits within the whole. And it's just like, either you take Derrida for what he is and his own merit and virtue and say, okay, we're going to get something out of this, which I happen to do, or you're going to, again, tell him he's not passing his philosophy exams as a young person, and he did fail. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is there's no monopoly on this problem of the responsibility of taking care of the tradition. To come back to that theme. But the starting point is confounding for both thinkers. Perhaps it's confounding for Husserl, and Derrida's point is that Husserl is not making this explicit as a problematic, which is a problem with historicity.
Yeah.
And the reduction, therefore the reduction in the epoch. For Heidegger, there's the circle problem. And he says, I'm not dealing with the circle. I don't have a circle problem. You guys are going to say I have a circular problem, but I don't. It's a relatedness problem. Which for our Anglo-American thinkers, for their part, is going to bring what Sheehan and others, this problem of movement of existence. This is kind of relatedness, and not ontic motion or change of a thing or development of money or time, etc. But it's just this, is it the movedness? And you could bring it back to Aristotle, and what's being moved in us to, I think Sargo was getting at that with Eckhart, or maybe aside, and it's recall where, why are we compelled to pose this question? Because we're in it.
Yeah.
Okay, so 1037, we're going to continue with section 3 and then chapter 3. And I don't have a magic wand here, and honestly, I might be asking us to do something, and then when we get to it, we're gonna like, wait a minute, it's gonna stretch us because there may be no apparent connections. Maybe I've gotten lucky so far, but connections appearing. But I don't know what deconstruction is, but somehow those connections appear. Let's see what happens though. Any parting thoughts for today's session? Or okay, well, thank you
Could you
all.
recommend something from Husserl's? Sorry.
Oh,
Could you recommend a section from Husserl, Formal and Transcendental Logic? Which is
not
relevant. You
that, but
mentioned it, and it's mentioned in the text several times.
yeah, I can look it up, but if you can get yourself back to the sixth investigation of the logical investigations, which is a volume 2, the Rutledge, because it's just, I mean, you're going to do all 6 investigations. You don't need to, but that's the whole sense and understanding part. Which, by the way, is not the Kantian way into it, which is what Previn's getting at. And that's everything there, especially this problem of the thinghood. So is it the massive apperception of consciousness enacting itself, not just in reflecting back on itself, but in that essential description of anything? It's not just the activation problem, which we know, and then the temporality of that, the retentions of Derrida coming in one way, but Heidegger. It is not the relationship between time and consciousness. If that's Kant, Hegel's going to try to resolve that. But this problem of activation, maybe even being alive.
Thank you.
Activation of sense, existence in the world. Something's going on, but you need that. If you want to, Paul, get a hold of that 6th investigation. Or maybe we bring that in too.
I think Raj may.
I think we're frozen. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. Let's stop.